The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, how to rescue our schools from financial collapse, how to bridge the digital divide for all Americans, plus Bill Press with South Carolina Congressman James Clyburn. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. The coronavirus pandemic is turning into a financial crisis for our nation's schools. Jeff Bryant explains what it will take to save public education from a looming catastrophe. And we say hello to Jeff Bryant, writing fellow and chief correspondent for Our Schools, a project of the Independent Media Institute. Jeff Bryant, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks, Mike, for having me on the show again. Always a pleasure.
And nice to speak with you as well. You've been writing extensively about the fate of schools and education during and after this pandemic. One of the biggest issues you've written about is what you call an economic tsunami that is crashing into schools as states are dealing with the economics or the economic fallout of the pandemic. How are we already seeing the impact on schools?
Well, according to the latest federal data, in the month of April alone, school districts across the country shed almost 500,000 education jobs, K-12 education jobs. Just in April, that's more educators and education support staff who lost their jobs during the Great Recession. So we're already in a super bad situation, and we haven't even talked about the next school year.
As you look ahead, how bad could this get for schools?
Well, according to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, there could be as much as $765 billion cut from education budgets over the next 3 years. That's about 3 to 5 times more than what they lost during the Great Recession. Looking back at the Great Recession, the effects on schools are still being felt in schools. Today, there are 77,000 fewer teachers in schools because of what happened during the cuts during the Great Recession. But in the meantime, there are 2 million more students. So by and large, schools haven't recovered from the last recession. And
Wow.
There, as a matter of fact, the majority of schools in the country are spending less today on schools and public education than they did in 2008. So if we're talking about a more substantial revenue shortfall this time than what happened last time, I shudder to think of what could happen.
Absolutely. And, the way schools are funded, it's often a split between state and local funding, and the local funding often comes from property taxes. What does that mean for how different communities could be impacted by these budget cuts?
It means a lot. Generally speaking, states contribute about 47% of what school districts spend. Local areas contribute 42%, and the federal government picks up the rest of the tab. But the amount of money that can be raised locally varies a lot from state to state, because those local revenues are reliant almost exclusively on real estate values, property taxes. And as you know, real estate values vary a lot from place to place. So in some communities that have very low real estate values, they're not able to raise enough money to pay for their schools. Now, most states have formulas that help make up the difference. Some of those state formulas are not very good. Some of them are better than others, but they're almost all in need of revising and updating. But now you're talking about states not being able to even be able to raise their proportion of the funding. So those low-income communities with low real estate values are going to be particularly hard hit. In wealthier communities, there is some tolerance for raising property taxes to help make up the shortfalls. But in poor places, places where poor people live, they're not going to be able to raise property taxes and do that. The case in point, the worst kinds of cuts that states can enact, which is what they did during the Great Recession, is to just do across-the-board cuts and cut every district equally. Well, we know that a 10% reduction in a wealthy community that doesn't rely that much on state is not going to be felt nearly as hard as a low-income community that gets most of their money from the state.
Yeah, absolutely. And another factor at play here is the move to online schooling. How are private charter schools moving in to take advantage of the moment?
Well, we're getting a lot of evidence that online charter schools, for-profit or not-for-profit, and charter schools that have been able to move their operations quickly online, and then also ed tech companies are engaging in very aggressive marketing and sales tactics. According to a recent survey of school leaders conducted by the Superintendent's Roundtable, school leaders said that they had been contacted more frequently since the pandemic broke out and schools closed. Only 20% of those school districts said that those, or 20% of those school leaders said that those contacts from ed tech companies or online providers or other kinds of vendors were positive. So the vast majority of those contacts were either very negative or of no help at all, which is tantamount to being negative. We're also seeing examples of parents and teachers being bombarded with marketing from various vendors, including the online charters. Oftentimes, these services are being offered for free as an enticement, but of course, you've got to put your credit card up. And also, you might not notice in the fine print the terms of the deal later on. So there's a lot of alarming instances of these sort of shady dealings going on so far, and it's just going to get worse.
Yeah, and speaking of getting worse, into the story, as you have written, comes Betsy DeVos and her personal agenda. What is her agenda?
Well, I think her agenda is very well known. She's had a decades-long track record of trying to divert public school money to charter schools, private schools, and religious schools. She practiced most of her craft in Michigan, where she was very successful through her wealth at funding candidates and funding organizations that push through these market-based ideas. The results in Michigan have been horrible. Michigan used to be, according to national assessments, in the top tier of performance, plummeted down to below tier. And so I think she's now wanting to bring that sort of effort into a national position and roll that roll those kinds of ideas out for the whole country. I don't think she makes any bones about hiding that agenda.
Well, I mean, in the midst of the pandemic, there's DeVos already taking action to advance her agenda. What has she been able to accomplish so far?
She's been able to accomplish a lot. One of the first things she did was declare that she was going to take a portion of the aid that Congress is providing to schools in the CARES Act. It's a little over $13 billion. She wants to take a portion of that and turn it into micro grants that will be doled out to individual parents and maybe other kind of entities like companies or vendors or things like that. We're not even sure yet. Now, these micro grants operate just like a typical voucher. In other words, the funds are being given to whoever, the parent is oftentimes the case, to use as they prefer. Sometimes these funds are given in the form of a savings account that has a debit card connected to it. We've already seen that in states that have tried this, there's widespread fraud There's a little to no accountability for how the money is being spent. So the microgrant idea is what she acted on first. More recently, she's rolled out a change to the guidelines for how federal money will be given out, how this aid to schools will be given out. And she's changing the guidelines so that more money will go to private schools rather than to schools that teach low-income kids. Already, members of Congress in the Democratic Party have written an angry letter voicing their opposition to this. We've seen a handful of states say that they are not going to follow these guidelines. We've even had one of the leading education Republicans in the Senate, Lamar Alexander of Tennessee, disagree with her on these guidelines. But instead of listening to people and acquiescing, she's doubling down. She's saying that she's going to turn those guidelines into what is called an interim term rule, which would mean that her ideas would become law immediately until Congress did something to overturn them. This is going to be, in some communities, catastrophic, especially communities that have a lot of private schools, and at the same time, a lot of schools that serve low-income kids, because what they're going to do is they're going to see millions of dollars that they're going to have to withhold from the schools that these low-income kids attend, and then dole it out to private schools when the private schools request it.
It just sounds, it's not surprising coming from this overall administration. We're speaking with Jeff Bryant, writing fellow and chief correspondent for Our Schools, a project of the Independent Media Institute. And so, Jeff, as DeVos continues her campaign to champion charter schools, what do we need to know about their impact on the overall mission of public education?
It's very hard to generalize about charter schools because they vary so much from place to place. Some of them are small independent charters, and some of them are huge chains. Some of them we know aren't very good at all, and some seem to do a pretty good job. But one generalization we can make about charter schools is that they harm public schools financing. And it's because of the way charter schools are financed. The way that the funding works is that children essentially have what some people call a backpack full of cash that follows them wherever they go to school. And so when a child leaves a public school and moves to a charter school, that money follows along with him. The money follows the child. The problem with that is that if 10% of students leave a public school to go to charters, the public school is in a position of not being able to cut 10% of their school spending. They can't cut the spending for the transportation. They can't cut spending for the physical plant. They might not even be able to fire any course teaching teachers. For instance, you might not be able to fire any of the math teachers because you still have a substantial portion of your students there. So what they tend to do instead is they look for program to cut, like they'll cut the drama program, the library, they'll fire the nurse. And so what you have is as more and more students filter away to charters, the school loses its capacity to be the kind of full, well-rounded school that we expect. And that causes, in turn, more parents to see, well, this school is on the downslope, I'm getting out of here.
So clearly Democrats need to confront this directly and find a way to support public schools. What needs to happen at the congressional level?
Well, at the congressional level, first of all, we need Congress to rein in Betsy DeVos, particularly on these on her interpretation of these guidelines. She's violating the law, and she needs to be called into account for it. Second of all, Congress needs to advocate for and push through a substantial amount of more aid for our ailing and struggling schools. They're about to get hit with a tsunami, as you said. And because they rely on states and local governments, and these governments, state and local governments, have to operate on balanced budgets. The federal government does not. So the federal government needs to severely raise the stakes. There are various ideas out there for how much more the federal government needs to contribute. But we need to see a new aid bill for school pushed through by Congress and hopefully signed by the administration. Mm-hmm. Although I know it's hard to believe sometimes that will happen.
Certainly not this administration.
Right, exactly. Second of all, we need to see states think of new ways that they can raise revenue for school. For schools, we're not talking about this in terms of just if it being just a budget problem. What we have is a revenue problem. State revenues are taking a big hit because businesses closed and there's high unemployment. That means less money being raised through income taxes and through sales taxes and other forms of income generation. So states have to get a little bit more creative. For instance, if they have an income tax, and most states do, they need to think of ways of changing that tax and that tax system that's in a progressive way, so that wealthier people are paying more money for schools. They need to be very risky, maybe even with their rainy day funds, spend those down, because we know that the more you cut public jobs and teachers and public education, the deeper harm is committed throughout all of the community, and the harder it is to come back when when we start to climb out of this recession.
Yeah. Well, and clearly, as you say, I mean, the fight also happens at the state and local level. So what words of advice do you have for advocates of public education, from parents to teachers to district administrators?
I think you need to talk about what's happening in schools in very concrete terms. You need to raise the alarm, but do it not by just talking about budgets and money, but talk about what's happening to teachers and what's being taken away from children. You look at the recent examples, for instance, of the protests that teachers staged across the country in the past 2 years. And in those protests, which were very effective, by the way, even when they happened in red states like Oklahoma and Arizona, the teacher uprisings were able to get legislatures to pass new budgets that raised income for schools. You look at what those teachers did, and what they pointed to were very specific things that money pays for in schools. Like, look at my textbooks. Look at what the condition of my classroom is. Look at what I'm not able to do for my students because the money isn't there anymore. Look at how much money I have to spend out of my own pocket because the state's not paying for its fair share. And you talk, and parents can do this too. When you talk to your school board members, talk to your members of Congress and state representatives, talk about the things that your schools provide that you know will be cut. And those are the things that have meaning for people, because they remember when they went to school and what it would have been like if that art program hadn't been there, if that school play had never taken place, if they had never been able to play in the marching band.
Yeah. Well, and when you mentioned those protests, and I find them to have been so much more effective than the typical work stoppage type of protest, where they've always been about, we need more money, we want more money, or we want better health care, we want this, we want this. Those teachers were there not for themselves, but for their kids. And I found that to be a much more effective tool, and I think that's why they had some success. Yes.
And another thing they did is they formed coalitions with others in the community. They worked in tandem with civil rights leaders. They worked with we were talking about mostly teachers that were involved in these rallies, but they also reached out to the cafeteria workers. They reached out to the bus drivers. They included local health providers. They talked with social workers where they came from the schools, or they came from local agencies, and they formed a coalition so they could present a unified front that we're talking about the health and well-being of children, and we're talking about the entire spectrum of needs in our communities. We're talking about what parents need too, in terms of after-school programs, in terms of job training, in terms of summertime opportunities for their kids. And that was also what was very key, and that's what we need to do again in order to fight these revenue hits that we're going to be taking in the next 2-3 years.
Absolutely. And as good a job as they did, as you point out, there's a lot more work to do. Jeff Bryant, writing fellow and chief correspondent for Our Schools, a project of the Independent Media Institute, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Jeff, we certainly appreciate your time with us. Would love to have you back again and talk more about it soon.
Thanks again, Michael. Take care.
Thank you. And you're of course, we will, and you as well. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Social Security measure. I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, why internet access should be a civil right. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Many Americans can't believe that political coups are part of our country's history. But consider the Wall Street Putsch of 1933. Never heard of it? It was a corporate conspiracy to oust Franklin Roosevelt, who had just been elected president. With the Great Depression raging and millions of families financially devastated, FDR had launched several economic recovery programs to help people get back on their feet. To pay for this crucial effort, he had the audacity to raise taxes on the wealthy, and this enraged a group of Wall Street multimillionaires. Wailing that their, quote, liberty to grab as much wealth as possible was being shackled, they accused the president of mounting a class war. To pull off their coup, they plotted to enlist a private military force made up of destitute World War I veterans who were upset at not receiving promised federal bonus payments. One of the multimillionaire's lackeys reached out to a well-respected advocate for veterans, retired Marine General Smedley Darlington Butler. They wanted him to lead 500,000 veterans in a march on Washington to force FDR from the White House. But they chose the wrong general. Butler was a patriot and lifelong soldier for democracy who in his later years was critical of corporate war profiteering, and he was repulsed by the hubris and treachery of these Wall Street aristocrats. He reached out to a reporter, and together they gathered proof to take to Congress. A special congressional committee investigated and found Butler's story, quote, alarmingly true, leading to public hearings with Smedley Darlington Butler giving detailed testimony. This is Jim Hightower saying, by exposing the traitors, this courageous patriot nipped their coup d'etat in the bud. But their sense of entitlement reveals that we must beware of the concentrated wealth of the imperious rich, for it poses an ever-present danger to your and my majority rule.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. During this pandemic, the internet is a lifeline. That's why former FCC Commissioner Michael Copps says the time is now to guarantee broadband access for all Americans. And we say hello to Michael Copps, Special Advisor to Common Cause. From 2001 to 2011, he served as a member of the Federal Communications Commission, where his tenure was marked by a consistent embrace of the public interest. Michael Copps, thank you very much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
And I say hello to Jim Cuddy and your listeners. Thanks for having me on.
Well, our pleasure to have you with us. This pandemic opens up several fault lines in terms of the nation's communications systems. One of them is the digital divide. And with so many people working at home, you and I are working from home today ourselves, and students attending school at home, and universal broadband access is ever more vital. Your current predecessor at the FCC, Chairman Ajit Pai, issued a statement calling on broadband providers to open Wi-Fi hotspots to any American who needs them. But does that go far enough?
Well, really, no. You know, the current FCC and its majority, Republican majority, has spent the last few years really stripping away any authority it has to enforce things. So, yeah, it's fine to go and say to the big monopoly carriers, you know, hey, would you please do this? And to some extent, they have complied. But there's no ability at the FCC to enforce that or to develop some standards of its own to make sure that Americans are covered. And, you know, we had a tremendous digital gap to begin with before we had 36 million Americans applying for unemployment compensation. And how do you make sure all of them are connected? We have, we're way behind in the race among nations to get broadband out to all of our citizens. So we've taken some steps, and I commend them for trying to respond to some extent, but they have put themselves in the trap of not being able to respond with the strength and enforcement powers that they should really have.
You know, and this maybe this is an obvious answered question, but what do we know about the extent of broadband access in the U.S. and who's impacted by a lack of access?
Well, we don't know enough to begin with because the FCC has been remiss over the years in really mapping who has broadband. So what do? We rely on the big companies to tell us. And a lot of these companies report back and they say, well, there's one person out in this zone, this particular area that subscribes to broadband. Ergo, everybody there has broadband. So they count it that way. So we know that there are a lot of people that aren't covered. There could be as many as, I don't know. I think even the Census Bureau says 22 million Americans households don't have broadband. I think it's higher than that. I think if we had real maps and really a good picture of what's happening in the inner city, what's happening in rural America, what's happening on the lands where indigenous people live, we'd find that probably 40, 50 million people don't have broadband. And that's really sad. Here we are in 2020. We've been talking about this problem for 20, 25 years now, and we still don't have this necessary utility available on an affordable basis to millions of Americans. That's sad. It's hurting our country. It's hurting us as individuals, and it's hurting us as a nation with our ability to compete and be prosperous.
And, you know, I'm going to go back to the Wi-Fi hotspots. You know, all these large companies are opening them up, but what about all those smaller companies that may not be a part of that offer access to broadband? They're not necessarily opening up their Wi-Fi hotspots.
No, and there's not enough of them because we have the big carriers who are monopolizing so many of these markets. There's a lot of places that don't have any broadband providers, and there are places that have one broadband provider. Well, there's no competition there, and that leads to the problem with affordability. How are people going to afford this monthly broadband, which I think our average in this country is $65 or $70 a month. You look at other countries in Europe and Asia, it's in the $20s and $30 range. So we've got a digital divide, not just rural and urban, but well off and not so well off, and long way to go.
Yeah.
We haven't built this infrastructure out in a way that America used to build infrastructure. We used to have a sense of national mission, which would be established by the federal government. Then they'd work with the private sector cooperatively. There'd be public-private partnerships, state governments, municipal governments, everybody be involved to build the roads and bridges and canals and railroads and highways and rural electricity and even basic telecom. Then along comes the Reagan Revolution and the Bush second revolution. And oh, no, that's not the American way. The American way is for the market to do everything. The invisible hand of the market will bring broadband to everybody. And, who should have expected that? I mean, business isn't going to go where there's no possibility of making a buck. So you can't do it without public-private partnerships and some public resources. And most of all, leadership at the top that says, okay, this is essential. This is necessary for people to be fully participating in our society and fully productive. We're going to get it done. We're not just going to wait for the Universal Service Fund of the FCC to finance this. We understand it's more money than that. We should have done this 20 years ago. And had we done it, we wouldn't be having this discussion right now.
Yeah, and I wouldn't have the opportunity to talk with you, and I'd miss out on that. But I think that would probably overall, for most of us, that would be a good thing.
We'd find other stuff to talk about.
Right, exactly. You've long called broadband access a civil right. And in a recent post at the Benton Institute for Broadband and Society, you wrote that America is at a crossroads. Do you feel that this could be the moment when lawmakers and industry finally address this issue in meaningful ways?
It could be, and every once in a while, a few times a day, I say, boy, things are really going to be different going forward. We're really learning from this combination of the COVID virus and the necessity for broadband. But to really change, a lot has to change. A lot has to change in government with the ideology that it has. This market can do it all nonsense, and a lot has to change with the role of the special interests and big money in Washington, in the executive branch, in the agencies, and certainly in the Congress that makes our laws. We've got to elect people who are representative of the American people and who will get some of this stuff done, and it's so difficult for them to do that in an era when we have this insane influence of industry lobbyists and industry money, and complicated by the redistricting that special interests pay for in the state capitals. So yes, it could be the moment, but it's going to have to continue. It's going to have to be not just this week with protests and all. It's going to have to go on a continuing basis, and it's going to have to be in November. People get out and vote. In the final analysis, so got to do that. It all depends on the base. It all depends upon the people themselves. Reform, I don't believe the kind of reform we're looking for is imminent, coming from Washington, D.C. as a gift from our benevolent lawmakers. I don't think that's the way reform ever works, whether it's worker rights or civil rights, labor rights, women's rights, you name it. That's got to bubble up, and we see bubbles out there now, and we got to keep it bubbling and keep it bubbling through the election, and then not just say after the election, even if that turns out right, okay, we're done. Then you got to keep after those people that you've just elected to go ahead and fulfill their pledges and get these basic things done. But you're on the civil right. I just make a quick comment on that. You're right. I have long called. You cannot be a fully productive member of our society, a fully participating member, without broadband. I mean, whether it's looking for a job, educating yourself, taking care of your health, doing your homework, you name it, it can't be done. And we're seeing these divisions and these gaps right now. How would we all complain, I'm sitting here and we've got modern communications, but there are a lot of people in this country who have nothing. What are they supposed to be doing right now while they're isolated? How do they get their food? How do they get their education? How do they get any medical advice? You can't do it. So this is a civil right. You have to have it, or you cannot be a fully participating citizen of the United States of America.
Yeah. And here we are in the midst of this pandemic. You've got people ordering their groceries online. You've got people doing everything online.
Yeah, if it wasn't for the broadband, I might be dead right now. I mean, I'm an older guy. I've had pneumonia in the past. I don't go out. My wife and I have been basically isolated. So we rely on grocery delivery. We rely on this to communicate, have discussions like this. My wife to do the things that she does, stay in touch with our families and kids, and find out what's going on in the world to the extent that we can.
Yeah. We're speaking with Michael Copps, Special Advisor to Common Cause, former FCC Commissioner. In terms of concrete solutions, and I'm going to do this in two parts, talking about the FCC for now, what can the FCC do right now, even without congressional action, to bridge the digital divide?
Well, first of all, we have a program for subsidizing broadband for the less well-off, for the poor. It's called Lifeline. And this present FCC majority has devoted a lot of attention to cutting back on this. I think we have maybe about, 7 million participants in something that probably 38 or 40 million American people would be eligible for. So we need to reach out with that. We have to make sure that our education, our E-rate, schools and education program that is run by the FCC is really reaching out, getting these hotspots out, finding ways to get computers and tablets to kids so they don't just use them in the classrooms where they cannot go now, but so they have them in their homes. And these are temporary things that the FCC could do now, but we still have that enduring problem. Once this is over, a lot of these things are going to go bye-bye, and the industry is going to say, okay, well, we made these pledges, but the virus is seemingly under control now, so we're going back to the way things were, and the way things were is not going to get us out of the hole that we've dug ourselves into.
Mm-hmm. All right, now let's turn it the other direction. Beyond those actions on the part of the FCC, what can Congress do to cement broadband access as a civil right?
Well, the House is, as a temporary measure, the House has passed something called the HEROES Act, which I think would provide up to like $4 billion for immediate aid to get broadband out of the hot spots and all of that. Whether Mitch McConnell and the Senate will deign to take that up, who knows? But then a little longer term, hopefully into a new administration, the FCC would try to get some of its authorities back to exercise oversight in the public interest for the common good, and to make sure that we had an active broadband deployment program, some performance standards, accurate maps, and really for the Congress to encourage the kind of public sector, private sector partnerships that I've been talking about, instead of a lot of state legislators and all have said, we don't want municipal broadband, or we don't want cooperatives doing broadband. That's changing a little bit now during the emergency, and I'm glad to see that. But excuse me, again, it goes back to the partnerships I was talking about. Municipalities should be a part of this. State government should be a part of this mission of building broadband out. So Congress ought to stipulate that. But again, that would take a very different Congress than we have now, and it would take a diminution in the power of big money to have its way and have its sway on Capitol Hill.
Nothing moves very much with this current Congress, or the last couple for that matter. In the midst of this pandemic, you've also been speaking out about the critical role of local news, near and dear to my heart, certainly. Why is this such an important moment to do what we can to protect local news outlets?
Well, in the middle of this COVID crisis, every day we're opening the paper and we're seeing newspapers laying off journalists. Already, before the COVID crisis, we've lost half of our newsroom employees in the United States since 2000, 2004. Up until now, I read recently there's another 35 or 36,000 newsroom employees without a job. And here are communities that are relying on information. What's happening in this part of the city, that part of the city? Where is the testing available and all that? And if you lose these local outlets that are closing up, not just because of the coronavirus, but closing up because of all the massive consolidation that we've had in the media industry and the shutting down of local newsrooms, combining them so you have fewer journalists chasing the stories. If you don't have that kind of information, you're really hurting the ability of citizens to grapple with the problems that they have right now. This is maybe my central cause, if you want to call it that, but our news and information infrastructure in this country is in very bad shape. We just don't have the kind of coverage we used to have. We don't have the local, we don't have the state house coverage that we used to have. And there's a heck of a lot more laws that are being passed in state capitals than there are by this inactive Congress that we have here in Washington, D.C. But it's not being covered, and the special interests go in there, and they put state regulatory agencies out of business. They take away their jurisdiction and their authority. It's all part of this dismantlement of government, which the special interests have been chasing for years, and which Donald Trump believes in so fervently, and which the Republican majority at the FCC believes in too. And I tell you, a few more years of this, and there won't be any government to speak of left. There won't be any public interest. Your regulatory agencies will be out of business. And in the meantime, when you appeal all this to the courts, they're building a court system that's going in the opposite direction, just like the special interests want them to go.
Yeah, very much so. And, even before the pandemic, you were drawing our attention to the role of the FCC in contributing to the decline in local news. What is it that they're getting wrong?
Well, it's this whole approach that we've had. As part of it is ideological. Maybe they actually believe this this nonsense about government is the enemy and all that. And if we've seen anything in this coronavirus pandemic, it's that people are looking to the public sector, looking to government for help, not just financial assistance, but in many other ways. But we've gotten it so wrong for 20 years now that there's nothing wrong with consolidation. It's market, it's economies and efficiencies. I spent 11 years at the FCC just seeing one stream of one group of CEOs after another coming in saying, you have to let us merge our media stations. We'll do so much more news that way. So and usually they find a majority at the FCC, mostly over my objections, most of the time, to culminate these mergers, to conclude them. And then they look around, they say, oh, gee, we just spent, 20, 30, $40 billion. We got to pay for this merger now. What do we do? Oh, I know what we'll do. We'll fire some journalists, or we'll close the newsroom, or combine the journalism. And and at the same time, instead of the local news and hard news and real investigative journalism, because they fired all these journalists, you get all this infotainment and pablum, and we have elections that are nothing but glorified reality shows, and you don't get the deep dive journalism and coverage that you used to have. And you really begin to wonder, at a point, well, long past beginning to wonder, how long can a self-governing society sustain itself if it is lacking factual information, real news, and real information upon which voters can base intelligent decisions for the future? And we are mighty close to losing the whole thing if we don't get hold of this problem. So we have a lot of problems in this country. I don't know one that's more serious than that.
The other thing, too, that you see now with some of these smaller, hyper-local news outfits, that they have a pay to listen or a pay to read and that sort of thing type of structure, and they're foregoing that during the coronavirus pandemic or during some sort of emergency, and they're saying, you know what, these articles are for free, or these news stories are free for you. They can't hold on that much longer. They still have to pay reporters and people to go out and get these stories and construct these stories. I mean, Congress, what can Congress do to preserve the resource?
Well, there's a lot of things we could do. I could talk about putting the brakes on all of these mergers that we've had, trying to encourage some competition, go back to localism, competition, and diversity. At some point, you actually begin to wonder, is there a commercial resolution of this problem? And I like to think there is, and I think there are things that can be done. But increasingly, I'm drawn to the idea that there has to be a lot more public sector participation in the media, public support for media, like so many other countries have. And we know the only debate we have in Washington, D.C. about supporting public media is whether we're going to hold it at the paltry sum it's at right now or zero it out, when lots of other countries in Europe and elsewhere are putting billions of dollars into public media. Now, when I say that, people are going to say, oh, well, that means government control of the media. But if you look at every year, The Economist and one or two other groups put out rankings of democratic nations. Who's the most democratic nation? We're kind of down on that list. But the ones that are on top also have extensive public media. And it's not rocket science to figure out firewalls that you can have between the government and the administration of that program, but we have to have more resources. There has to be some public monies going into journalism and into media if we're going to have a news and information infrastructure that's worthy of our democracy and making sure that we can hold on to that democracy.
We also, unfortunately, have a president right now that belittles, destroys in any way he can, any time he can, the media, the mainstream media, and whatever he likes to call it. I can't think of anything more dangerous than that. No,
that's true. And, some of this, there's a new threat every day. I don't think some of it can necessarily be translated into law or policy, but it's the intimidation. He knows an election is coming, and he knows if he just keeps hitting. Well, maybe he'll back off a little bit. Maybe they'll be a little nicer to me. And we've never had, since the time of the Alien and Sedition Acts, I guess, back after at the founding of our country, we've never had a threat, and this is maybe even worse than that, to the freedom of the press. And we are really messing around with some fundamental ingredients of democracy when we do that.
I would say that November can't come soon enough.
Right. Yeah, you're right. I don't want to sound more depressing than I have already, but you really worry about our ability to carry off a really credible election with all the legal suits that'll probably follow if Trump doesn't do well and all that. But let's do one step at a time, and let's get everybody out there and vote. Make sure that everybody that's protesting is voting, because they're both necessary right now. And let's get serious about how we're going to conduct this election. Are we going to have paper ballots, and how's that going to work, and how are they going to be authenticated and all that? We're in June. I mean, this election's only a little ways off. And It's time to get awfully darn serious about how it's going to be conducted so that people will respect the results of it.
Amen. Michael Copps, Special Advisor to Common Cause, former Federal Communications Commissioner, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Michael, we appreciate your time with us and would love to have you back again soon.
Anytime. I enjoyed talking with you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Will this time be different? Bill Press talks with South Carolina Congressman James Clyburn about the fight to end systemic racism in America.
I have really been reminiscing a lot lately. When I saw the reaction to George Floyd's lynching, I thought back to the ho-humness that took place throughout this country during the late 60s over the burning of buses with students on them from the Freedom Rides. I thought about Philadelphia, Mississippi, and the killing of those three Black, white, and Jewish students. And of course, I thought back to John Lewis's trek over the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And I said to myself, this time things feel a little different. And I would hope that this time we would not allow the sloganeering that took place back in the 60s to hijack this effort. And so I've been very, very cautious and very concerned about that. And so that's why I've been really pushing back hard on the sloganeering that's taking place, the sound bites that are being developed, the headlines that are floating around out here, to hopeful that this time we won't repeat the mistakes that took place the last time.
And you're referring, I believe, Congressman, particularly to the slogan, defund the police, correct?
Yes, that's one of them. I am very concerned about that. I know what people say it means. And all I say to that is, if that's what it means, then say that. Don't use these slogans that will get headlines and destroy the headway that we can make.
You know, Congressman, the Attorney General and the President of the United States, they insist that there is no systemic racism in law enforcement in this country. Your experience and your history would tell you differently, I would imagine.
Yes, and I think that their experiences would tell them differently if they were to tell the truth. This president knows what role he played in the Central Park Five. He knows what role he played with the rental of his apartment units. He knows that racism is institutionalized in this country. And if he doesn't know it, maybe he ought to sit down in one of those history classes that I used to teach. I tell you, you got to be on another planet if you don't know the difference.
You know, Congressman, one thing that puzzles me is this is hardly, with George Floyd's murder, the first case that we've had to deal with. I mean, I think back even recently to Trayvon Martin and to Tamir Rice and to Eric Gardner. You can go all the way back to the Orangeburg massacre at South Carolina State 52 years ago. Why is this one different, do you think? What took so long to really wake up the American people?
Well, Bill, this may surprise you, but I really believe that this today has roots in the Emanuel 9. I think that this country started to take stock of itself, started to re-examine its attitudes after those 9 souls were summarily murdered doing their Bible study in the basement of an historic African-American church by a 21-year-old self-professed white supremacist. It was the reaction to that by the people there in Charleston when they stood several days later and looked at that young man and said, "I forgive you." I think it was at that moment that a lot of people in this country, Black and white, began to re-examine their attitudes. And I think that over the next now 5 years, as of tomorrow, when we celebrate the 5th anniversary of that, I think that's when it all got started. And now people are saying the families of the Emanuel 9, the community of Charleston, the president of the United States who visited that community and brought amazing grace to the country. I think that's when people started saying, wait a minute, we need to re-examine our attitudes. And so I think that that's what led to a lot of this.
And do you believe that this time, there have been, of course, protests before, and then the protests go away and life goes on. Do you think this time it will be different, that this movement will lead to some real reform?
I really think so. And that's why I have been pushing back so hard. And I've asked some of my friends and some of my colleagues to push back on this as well. I would hope that we, having the benefit of history, as George Santayana once warned us, if we fail to learn the lessons of history, we are bound to repeat them. If we learn the lessons that came out of the 60s, we would know not to allow ourselves to repeat those lessons, that history. And we could repeat that same history if we do not put these lessons to practice. And so that's why I've been pushing back. So that movement got hijacked with the burn, baby, burn headlines. And a lot of people were proud of themselves when they saw these headlines. I was never proud. Then John Lewis and I have talked about it often over the years, how so much of what we did could have been different if it had not gotten hijacked. And so I don't want to see this movement get hijacked. It is where it needs to be. Communities are moving, much like Victor Hugo, who wrote, "Nothing is more powerful in all the world than the idea whose time has come." The time has come. It's a great idea. Let's don't let anybody hijack it.
And Congressman, I know you've been one of the leaders putting together the response of House Democrats to the Black Lives Matter movement. But what are the kind of reforms that you'd like to see? I mean, how do you fix this problem? Is it better training? Is it, better recruiting? Or what are the few changes you think are really necessary?
Well, the big change has got to be the restructuring of policing. We've got to dismantle a culture. A culture has developed. It's not about training. These people are doing things that they aren't trained to do. It's about a subterranean activity taking place. There's something going on in policing in this country that's outside of training. It's a culture that is developed that has to be dismantled. That's what we've got to do. Restructure policing, dismantle this culture. And all of us can do that working together. We just cannot allow qualified immunity to be the order of the day, because that's what reinforces this culture. And so I would say to Mitch McConnell or any of my friends in the Senate, if you got a problem with qualified immunity, you are trying to maintain a culture that allows police officers to shoot and kill a 7-month pregnant woman, or allow a policeman to just shoot to death an unarmed, delirious man, because you know that qualified immunity will allow you to get away with it. I guarantee you that's what was going on in that man's mind, that policeman in Atlanta, who in all of this going on around him, saw fit to shoot this young man in the back twice after talking to him so civilly for 20 minutes. And then rather than let him go, walk to his sister's house, wanted to handcuff him. Why? Because his culture says this is one more black person that I can give a record to that will render him ineligible to vote and make him a second-class citizen for the rest of his life. That's the culture that's being perpetuated here, and qualified immunity continues that.
Do you believe that there are enough Republican senators who understand the problem and understand the need to fix it, that we can get legislation through the Senate as well?
Well, there are enough of them who understand it, but to get them to vote when this president is off in another direction, that's another question. It'll take about 15 polls showing him 15 points down to change their minds.
Well, hopefully we'll see those. Well, after all, Congressman, Donald Trump says, he said it again this week, that after Abraham Lincoln, he has done more for African Americans in this country than any other president. You've seen a few presidents. Do you buy that?
Well, this president has a strange relationship with the truth. This president would know a fact if it were sitting on his desk. So we can give credence to that if you want to. I would say to my friends in the Senate and those people who support him, many of whom are right here in South Carolina, show me one thing in this president's record that could stand up to any one thing that Lyndon Johnson put before us back in 1964 and 1965. Where is the Civil Rights Act of 1964? Where is his Voting Rights Act of 1965? What he's doing is trying to take away an Affordable Care Act when Lyndon Johnson gave us Medicare and Medicaid. So I would like very much for him to show me just one thing that he has done that positively impacts African American. There's not a single one thing he's done that can do that.
And what was your reaction, Congressman, when the president decides to start up his campaign again with a campaign rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma? He did move it from Juneteenth to the following day, but still the site of one of the biggest racist riots in this country's history, Tulsa, Oklahoma. What does that tell you about Donald Trump?
Now, tell me two things about Donald Trump. Donald Trump is dedicated to two things. Number one, erasing everything he can possibly erase of a positive nature coming from the Obama administration. And number two, he is trying to reinstate everything that came out of Woodrow Wilson's administration. And he, of course, is a big fan of Andrew Jackson. So when you look at where this guy's fan base may be and where his head is, then that tells you all you need to know about this president. He hates the Bushes. I may not have agreed with the Bushes on a whole lot, but I did agree with them on quite a bit. And I found them to be honorable people. And when he decided that he would go and kick off his campaign in Tulsa, Oklahoma, I thought of Philadelphia, Mississippi, and Ronald Reagan. And it was because of Philadelphia, Mississippi, and Ronald Reagan's announcement or first speech when he accepted his nomination, I could never, ever warm up to Ronald Reagan because I got his message.
Bill Press talking with Congressman James Clyburn of South Carolina. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressPods.com. That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Jeff Bryant, Michael Copps, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.